Welcome to the Grounded Presence Podcast, a place for exploring authentic identity, deep community, and the process of spiritual evolution. I'm Daniel Powell, and today on the show, I'm going to tell you a story about an experience I had with nature that took place a few months ago back in December. It was just a super rich moment in the natural world, and it's a very encouraging one to look back on, especially from this vantage point of being smack dab in the middle of winter. So I really hope you enjoy it. It was a lot of fun to relive this experience while I recorded this episode. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. All right, well, welcome to another episode of the Grounded Presence Podcast. How's it going for you out there? How's this winter season been treating you? So here in Denver, the snow has been falling a lot more frequently. We just got a huge storm and the temperatures have dropped like crazy. At the moment I'm recording this, it's early in the morning and the weather app is saying it's 0 degrees outside, so I'm not stepping outside for a while. Now I know I sound like a wimp to all you in the Midwest who just got hammered with that huge ice storm. You're probably like, well, if it's 0 degrees, where's the outdoor pool? Because I'm going swimming. But here in Denver, we've had a pretty easy first half of the winter. We just got our first decent snowstorm a few days ago, and I've got a feeling we're really going to keep getting hammered with snow and cold temperatures through the tail end of the season, because it's been a number of years since we've had a normal heavy winter, and we're overdue here in Denver. So if you live in Denver, just remember that you heard it here first, and if that hypothesis comes to be, tell all your friends and just say, hey, you know that Daniel Powell on the Grounded Presence Podcast? Oh, you've never heard of him? Well, you should listen to him because he makes super accurate weather predictions. He predicted this whole winter. But regardless of if it's harsh or mild, fall and winter have always been a super difficult time of year for me. Winter especially, it's when the daylight hours are at their minimum and nearly all the activities I like to do are forced indoors. Unless you're one of those crazy people who's into winter camping, I'm a summer guy. I love the warm weather. And I think maybe the absolute hardest part of winter is the way in which nearly all friendships seem to take a hiatus and go into a sort of state of hibernation. Now, my wife's favorite season is fall, which I've never understood. I mean, to me, fall has always been the precursor to a season of isolation, cold, achy fingers and toes, and months of vitamin D deficiency. And looking around at all the leaves withering and falling off the trees, seeing everything turn dull brown after the fall colors are gone, I've never seen the beauty in it. It's always been an omen of what's to come. It's been a season that signifies the death of warm temperatures and the death of life in the natural world. And further, the recession of sunlight and friendships. And that's always been really depressing to me. But okay, I'm a guy who loves the outdoors, but hates the cold and the snow. So maybe it's a little bit ironic that I live in Colorado, but here I am. Now, this winter in particular, I had an experience early in the season that shifted and made me view fall and winter through a new lens. And it was a really valuable experience for me. So I'm just going to share that story with you, and hopefully it'll be of some value to you too. Back in the middle of December, my wife and I were really feeling the effects of being driven indoors by the weather. And we were really itching to go outside and get a bit of exercise and fill our tanks with some sunshine. And a weekend came where there was a break in the cold weather. The temps got up into the 60s, probably like 65, and it was great. So we took the opportunity and escaped into the mountains for an afternoon and went for a hike up in Bailey, Colorado. And it was a little cooler up there, probably like mid 50s, high 60s, but it was still great with a light jacket. And we just ate it up. And now Bailey's a small town that's about half an hour into the hills. And we also took our 2-year-old daughter along for the journey and went on a little family hike. And this hike was a short loop that started out around a small mountain pond and then carried on through a meadow and crossed over a river and followed the river back to the trailhead. It was a nice short hike to take our 2-year-old daughter on without exhausting her too much. So the only downside to hiking with a toddler is that it makes you reduce your pace considerably. But it turns out that she was setting the exact pace that I needed to be walking at. Now, her pace was really quick. From the second we hit the trailhead, she was just zip, 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 darting back and forth across the trail, running and tugging on the grasses, like looking at the bushes, and she was just everywhere, like a toddler, you know? And she just kept running to bushes and pointing at them, looking back at me and saying, "Berries?" This girl loves to pick anything that she can call a berry, but there weren't any berries on the branches of the wild rosehip bush she was pointing to. It was a little too late in the season. But it was just so much fun watching her run around outside and explore nature. And normally on a warm day like this, and all the dead foliage of winter, I'd tend not to pay too much attention to the landscape. My focus would typically be more on a destination, trying to find a river to go sit by or something. Just trying to get somewhere that still feels a bit alive. But on this hike, I was spending a lot of time standing and waiting for my girl to finish exploring the periphery of the trail. And at some point, something started to shift in me. I started seeing something in between all the bare trees and dead grasses that surrounded me. What caught my eye first were all the cattails around the pond near the beginning of the trail. Those velvety white pods at the top of the stalks, those were all just exploding into this billowy white fluff that was slowly being carried off by the gentle breeze. It was pretty cool, and it was definitely beautiful in its own unique way, but that's just something I've never stopped to look at really before. And while I was distracted looking at the cattails, my daughter had picked up one of these fully intact cattails, and you could just tell in her mind, it's not a cattail, it's her royal scepter. So we resumed our slow walk up the tail as she frequently swung her scepter through the air. But soon enough, the scenery started to open up to me even more. We found ourselves in sort of a marshy mountain meadow after that. There were some evergreen trees on the surrounding hills that hinted at a living landscape, but everything around me still seemed dead. I was just surrounded by acres and acres of dead grasses. But the longer I stood there taking it all in and waiting for my daughter to finish her off-trail exploits, I started to notice the wide variety of colors all throughout the landscape. You had grasses that ranged from this toasty golden brown to like a light straw color. And I could even spot specks of gray and black on some of the dry and wilted blades of these long grasses. And then, there were some that were kind of buried in the mud, and they had just been permanently dyed this, nasty gray color. But there was just color all around me, I started to notice. Even if it was tilted towards, one corner of the color spectrum. Then I saw that there were colors of tree bark that spanned the entire spectrum of brown pigment, and a few acres of charred black trees that had been claimed by a wildfire a few years ago. And then there were fallen tree trunks that encompassed such a wide range of color. There was dark brown bark that was chipping away to reveal a pale gray trunk that had turned more of an ash white color at the other end of its length. And I'm standing there looking at all these trees and grasses and everything. But sure enough, once again, my daughter gets motivated to move down the trail, so she just goes, and I start chasing her. So I see now that she's traded her cattail for a little skinny twig that's about as long as her, and she's using it as her walking stick. It was super cute. After we walk a bit further through this marshy mountain meadow, we come to the section of trail that runs parallel with this partially frozen river. And once again, my daughter zips off the trail, and I walk a little further forward, but then I hear her shout, "Berries!" And I turn around and she's tugging on a branch, and I was like, what kind of berries did she find in the middle of winter? But sure enough, she found something. She had found something that kind of resembled a berry anyways. She was pulling off, so on the branches, she was pulling off these really small tubular pods that were a little thicker than a pencil, and they were about 2 inches long. At first, I couldn't figure out what these were. They had kind of a brownish red color to them and a really nubby texture. So think of like a really nubby brown caterpillar. And there were just tons and tons of these things hanging all over the tree in little clusters. And maybe even scaly is a good description of what these things looked like. Brown scales. So I started looking closer at the tree, trying to figure out what these things were. And I could see something else hanging on the branches in clusters. And they were these little pine cones, and they were super small. They couldn't have been any larger than a dime. And looking closer at these tiny pine cones, they had the smallest, most delicate scales, just like those little fins on the pine cone. And they were just small and delicate enough that you could even crush them up between your thumb and index finger with a decent amount of pressure. And this was when the landscape really, really started to open up to me. Observing all these little pine cones as they were growing was a new experience. I've lived in Denver for 23 years, so a pine cone's nothing new to me at all. But I'd never stopped and taken the time to notice how the trees go about growing and generating these pine cones. It was really interesting too, because these trees that were growing, these small pine cones, weren't even evergreen trees. They were deciduous trees that had lost their leaves for the winter. So it's the last place that I would expect to find a pine cone. So we continued to hang out for a while at the same spot by the river. And my daughter's just picking a bunch of her berries, and she proceeds to squat on the ground and pick them apart. She'd kind of break them in half and then roll them between her finger. And it was just a fun, tactile experience for a toddler. So I let her do her thing, and I took a seat in the grass on the other side of the trail while I watched her. But while I'm sitting there, I notice a pocket of some sort of really interesting species of grass that I'd never noticed or seen before. And these were these small golden straw stalks that looked similar to like a wily cousin of wheat. They only grew about a foot or two high, with a stalk that was no thicker than one of those miniature coffee straws. But at the end of the stalk was this curlicue portion with a single line of seed pods along the outer side. So think of a stalk of wheat that looks like a mohawk, and that's about what you got. It was a curlicue, so all the seed pods followed that contour, and each seed slowly tapered, coming to a point with its own little burr at the end. And these curlicues were small. They were just about big enough to maybe wrap around your thumb. And everything just came even more to life from there. I wasn't sitting in a dead natural world, and not even a lush world that was in recession. I was sitting on a hotbed of potential life. Everything wasn't dying, it was regenerating, it was renewing. It's all going to seed, and it's preparing to proliferate next season. The cattails were scattering themselves in the wind, and the trees were dropping these small pine cones full of seeds, and the spiny grasses were preparing each seed with its own little burr to hopefully attach itself to the fur of some wild animal and be carried to a new home. The landscape around me wasn't dead. It isn't in a recession. It's full of life, just in a more potential and pregnant form. And it's experiences and realizations like this that keep drawing me back to the natural world. The wisdom of rhythms and seasons, each one ripe with its own beauty. It's such a special experience to me to allow myself to surrender to that flow of nature, not needing to understand and analyze it, and not needing to control or direct it, but rather just sit and be a part of it. Not being the outside observer, but letting myself just really become absorbed into it. And allowing myself to be fully animal, if only for a moment, and let go of my need to dominate and conquer the natural world around me. After sitting with that experience for the past few months, I've come to this realization that it's little respites like that need to be what informs my human drive to dominate and conquer. Because I think those drives are good, ultimately. They provide us with a lot of value. They help me get things done. They help me keep myself safe, warm, and well-fed. But those drives can become misguided so easily and quickly. There's just something holistic about sitting in nature and being swept up in its beauty. And at the same time, just feeling how the natural world undulates through the seasons, and being connected to that undulation just for a second. it's just like this sense that the natural world is fighting for life, but it's not trying to avoid death. I think there's just something so profound and valuable in that, like just such a good lesson for humans. Fighting for life, but not fighting to avoid death. So I just love the experience of sitting there and just becoming an animal, like being dissolved into nature and into the flow of nature just for a second, and just allowing myself to be an animal in nature instead of removing myself from that environment and being a human that needs to protect myself from the natural elements and to harness them and control them in a way that's more beneficial and efficient for me and for our race. Whew. So I'm just going to stop there for a moment and take a breath, just step back and fall into this realization a little deeper. Now, are you with me there? Do you feel that? That's some special space. Have you ever had any experiences in nature like that yourself? Where you just stop and soak it in and don't analyze it? There's just something divine about that space. Something that I don't think needs any further description. It's something that can't be described. So there's this quote by William James that I just love. He says, "The mystical experience is ineffable, yet we try very hard to F it." And this experience of being drawn into the interconnectedness of all things in nature is nothing short of mystical experience. I think that's the foundation of the mystical experience, right? My experience on the hike is more of a light mystical experience, though I think as far as the nature of these experiences are concerned, but a valuable one nonetheless. It's a space that I want to keep coming back to, one that I think we would all benefit from, one that I think would benefit all of us on this earth. I would like to think that nature can affect us all in that same way. And I think we all probably have the same capacity to be similarly affected by it. Because at the end of the day, we are just all animals of the natural world. I think it's harder for some of us to connect with that. But full circle here, ultimately and primally, I think the winter tends to be so hard on my psyche because in the snow and freezing cold, it's much more of a challenge for me as a human to get out into nature. It's harder to sit and observe it, and it's harder to acknowledge that animal side of me because I think that self-protective, like physiological response kicks in me, and I'm more adverse to the cold than a lot of people. But it's way harder to connect with those rhythms because we retreat indoors into man-made structures and try to stay safe and warm and not catch a cold, which I think I'm starting to catch one right now. So hopefully my voice is good for the next podcast. But it's harder to acknowledge the holistic span of what it means to be human in this season. You know what? Maybe that's part of it too. Maybe that's the seed. Maybe we need to frequently be disconnected from our humanity so that we can reconnect with it and experience it again for the first time. Like maybe it's not about mastering this experience and living in a mystical experience, which I think is what a lot of people consider enlightenment to be. But maybe it's more a becoming aware of the process, right? Like that it's a process of connection and disconnection instead of just this process of becoming the ultimate human and being ultimately connected to yourself or connected to the divine or however you want to describe that. whatever, I guess, the ultimate goal of that experience, I think we'd all be better off if we just kept seeking it. So before I close the show out here, I wanted to share one last bit of inspiration with you that this experience and others like it have really embedded in me. So before I started this podcast, I wasn't on Instagram at all. Instagram is fun, but it was a bit of a shock getting into it, and it's become a bit of an addiction. I'm sure a few of you can relate with me on that level. This week I'm keeping it in check much better than others. And let's see here. Checking the activity meter on my account. It looks like okay, it's saying I've been on 25 minutes a day, so that's not great. But okay, looking at the little, I guess you'd call it a histogram, it looks like it hasn't been a full week either. And there's a big dip right in the middle where I'm going to say I've only been on it maybe 5 to 7 minutes a day. So that's what the graph tells me. So I've been doing good. So I'm going to give myself a pat on the back there for doing so well the past 4 or 5 days. Anyways, where I'm going with this is I've been looking at all these nature pictures of lush green mountain landscapes and foliage, and just pictures of the ocean and warm water and people swimming. And I've just been longing for the winter season to change over to spring and summer. I see these pictures and it's just like, man, I want to go there. I want to be there. I don't want to be here right now. But it's like the most artificial experience I can possibly have. It's one thing to long for warm weather, but sitting there looking at nature porn, essentially, it totally removes me from the current environment I'm in. And it seems a bit nefarious to me. I've recently followed this Keep It Wild hashtag Keep It Wild, which ironically seems to be nothing but these really highly processed and edited digital photos of nature. So not saying that's wrong, but just the irony of it. So anyway, when I was out on this hike with my daughter, I took a bunch of pictures of all of this nature that I was witnessing. You know, like any good millennial would, of course. I documented the whole trip. No piece of fantastic grass left unphotographed. And in tandem with the promotional posts for this episode, I'm going to alternate between promotional posts and pictures that I took on my hike. And they're not going to be edited, improved, or filtered. Just pictures, just the pictures as they stand. And we'll see how it goes. But I'd really like for this to be something that I continue doing on my Instagram for the foreseeable future. Just posting seasonally appropriate images from trips out into nature. Maybe pictures that I've taken within the past month, just so they're in a good time frame with the season. But just in an effort to push a little closer to that connection with nature and natural rhythms and the beauty of the seasons. I think it's going to be a fun little way to promote a more interconnected approach to life, even if it is still in the digital environment. All right, so keep an eye on the Instagram. I'd love to hear what you think about it, and if it works. We'll see. I really hope it does. I think it's going to be fun. Or, you know, instead of looking at the Instagram and telling me what you think about it, you could just go outside and open yourself up to a transcendent experience in nature. That would probably be preferential, actually. So, and hey, if you take pictures of your own, feel free to email them to me with your Instagram handle, and maybe I can post them in the feed and tag you, and we can make it into a thing. So that's all I have for you today. I just want to leave you with one last final thought here. The human that forgets they're an animal is not human at all. I like that. I've been using that as a mantra the past couple days, and I think it's drawn me closer to who I want to be. So I hope you enjoy that, and I hope it speaks to you in the same way. Well, that's all I have for you today. If you get some sunny weather, make sure to get out in nature and just immerse yourself in it for a moment. You won't be sorry you did. But if it's not sunny and it's dreary and you find yourself hanging out indoors and scrolling through social media, make sure to find me on Facebook and Instagram. That's where I hang out. On both of those, it's at The Grounded Presence. And like I said, I'll be posting some pictures from my hike. Share yours as well. I'll see you next time.